Welcome back, everybody, to Left Reckoning. I'm really excited to be doing this segment. We're joined today by Nick Bowlin. You can find them at Twitter at NPBowlin. He's a correspondent at High Country News. You can also find the work in The Nation, in Political Magazine, and this recent piece that just came out in a newer publication called The Drift Magazine, called, you can pull up too, Matt, Jokes on Them, the Democratic Party meets rural America. And he's going to help us break down some of the recent history of the Democratic Party and what a lot of particularly leftists and liberals are sort of missing about the puzzle as to what's happening in rural America. But before we get too further into it, thanks so much for joining us today, Nick.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm really excited to talk about this. I mean, here at Left Reckoning, we really try to make an effort to cover stuff that's happening around the rest of the country, because so much of left media very much is like hyper focused on like New York, LA, Chicago. And I think, a lot of leftists in particular sort of have a hard time imagining and understanding what is really happening in rural America, the political and social issues there. But before we get into all of that, I really was hoping that you could start us off by painting a picture as to just how bad it is right now for Democrats in rural America.
Yeah, I mean, I after the last election, it's kind of hard to overstate, and I think there's been a lot of there are a lot of conversations about the Republican dominance in rural areas, and I think one thing that sometimes gets left out is just how recent that is. I mean, I rural areas have trended red for a while, but there are examples really recent. 2010 Arkansas has had 2 Democratic senators, and I in my story I brought up areas like northern and western Minnesota, which was really strong Democratic farmer labor, the state Democratic Party, the DFL, really strong DFL territory for decades up until 2016 in some cases. But yeah, I mean, I think that the most recent exit polls that I think it was Pew Research data, Trump got more than 65% of the rural vote and more than 90% rural counties in 2020. And there's I don't think there's any evidence out there that shows that that's going to get better. I mean, it could conceivably get worse in 2024 at a national level. Although I guess at a certain point you would hit rock bottom. But yeah, it's not good for the Democrats.
And you note, and this is something I've experienced in my life as well. You note at the beginning of your piece in the Drift magazine about how there is a kind of political culture. Like you open up with this story about being in a rodeo, and the butt of the joke is Hillary Clinton, if I remember correctly. And you note that the politician can change, but the assumption is that everybody there is very happy, seeing these national Democratic figures sort of made fun of and brought down a couple pegs.
Yeah, I mean, it's I thought that anecdote was interesting for a number of reasons. In some part because the joke, and I won't kind of go into it, but it does involve a kind of like lying politician, and this was several years into the Trump administration, that it was just the county rodeo where I live in Colorado, and we kind of endless hours of CNN fact checks of Trump and everyone else, and how well his kind of uncountable number of lies over the years had been documented to death, and it sort of didn't matter. Like the audience for the joke, like the assumption that it was going to be a Democrat. And I've a friend locally here who said they used to tell the same joke about Bill Clinton, and you can find evidence that Obama was slotted in at some point. Like that's just there's this, and I think that's a good jump off for this discussion, is just that the dominant political culture is conservative. Now, I mean, I think my story tries to complicate that, but just like, on the surface at, public events of that sort, a county fair and a rodeo, that sort of thing, despite Trump's track record for mendacity and kind of lying just kind of every time he opens his mouth, like he wasn't going to be the butt of the joke.
Mm-hmm.
That history, just to jump into real quick, like is interesting because my parents aren't from, or my mother's side of the family is from eastern North Dakota, so very close to that Minnesota DFL stuff. More North Dakota, the nonpartisan league was active there. But it was the first time in my life was after the Bush administration when I heard part of the farming side of my family talking politics with the city, like sort of wage earner side of my family, and one of them literally said, like, I don't know how you can vote for a Republican. And that was a very strange thing to hear from like rural North Dakotans. Or, like it didn't seem strange to me, but like growing everything that we're going to talk about as far as like the sense of what rural folks think about politics, it flies in the face of that sort of connection. And it does. I mean, the DFL and the nonpartisan league, they do seem so far removed from their whole the like progressive era like origins. Could we talk a little bit about the class structure of rural America, and maybe we could start at the 1862 Homestead Act if you think that might be a good place to start.
Yeah. So, no, in the story, I bring up the Homestead Act just because, you know, as you say, like there is this kind of internal class structure to rural areas, and you know, no, like rural is a vague term. There are a million different rural areas in the U.S.,
Right.
but you know, that there is this sense that like the story of rural areas, especially when it comes to the resources, you know, and land being primarily what I was focusing on, and agricultural land especially, has been one of consolidation for more than 100 years. And you know, if you're always just talking about like culture war stuff, you're missing this, you know, kind of monopoly and corporate capture aspect. And so yeah, I mean, the Homestead Act was implemented by President Lincoln to try to get non-slaveholding landowners to settle the West. And you know, so it was during the Civil War, and parceling out 160-acre chunks of land, and you know, so on the one hand, there's the to make the land available for settlement, you had to kill off and remove all the indigenous nations that were there in the first place. But then, you know, in the West, especially, one of the results of the homestead, just because of poor enforcement and, you know, fraud of various kinds, is that, you know, big cattle barons and landholders were able to acquire just, you know, huge private holdings. And, you know, from then on, I mean, you can kind of trace, you know, going through, you know, some various farm crises in the late 19th, early 20th century, onto the Dust Bowl, onto the result of the New Deal. You know, all of these big federal policies, you know, often resulted in consolidation of various kinds. You know, going up to the New Deal era, one of the things that the Roosevelt administration did was implement production controls, to stabilize prices, and with the result being, along with some of the other things they did, of driving small farmers and tenant farmers off the land, and allowing like big agricultural empires. One of the most famous ones is Tyson. You know, that are still around to form because of the federal ag policy at the time. And this kind of gets at something that I wanted to talk about in the story, which is that, you know, when you talk about income inequality, it does have a kind of like, you know, transnational, you know, big city, you know, yeah, Wall Street connotate. You kind of think of big urban centers of capital movement. But you know, there's this really interesting research about income inequality in rural areas, which is that as population declines, which is, I mean, other than, you know, a few counties here and there, I mean, that's overwhelmingly been the story of rural counties over the past 40 years, is economic stagnation and population loss. As populations decline, income inequality is increased, and that's actually the inverse of how the accepted story on how income inequality works in cities. So they accepted as cities as a population grows, income inequality increases. Like the economy booms and it diversifies and businesses form and people come in and some people move ahead of others. But in rural areas, the story is more like that the economy has, economies have stagnated, jobs have been lost, job creation in rural areas just plummeted since the 70s. And so this is bad for basically everyone except like a select few who own the land or own some of the few surviving businesses or have an oil company or a construction firm or a franchised restaurant or something, whatever's kind of remaining, timber company, depending on what part of the country you're in. So that there's this kind of small, not billionaires, kind of like mid-level of capitalists in rural economies who have benefited, while kind of the vast majority of people in rural areas have not been able to get ahead financially and economically. And this has coincided with and this isn't just rural areas, that voting trends, if you're lower income, you're way less likely to vote. And there's a lot of impoverished rural areas, and so there's all this evidence that class of people who kind of held the resources that remain in rural economies is more likely to vote, but then also via things like the Chamber of Commerce or PACs or getting elected to the county commission or something like that. They're overwhelmingly responsible for like the political constitution of rural areas, like what we tend to think of as their conservative bent. And because Republican policies of deregulation and the like have benefited them. So when we talk about the rodeo and stuff like that, when you go to a rodeo in Western Colorado, the people who are at the rodeo tend to be landowners. So I that's anecdotal on my part, but I think that ignoring that kind of internal class hierarchy, that there's this local class of gentry, which is, I think, is a good word for it, because it's associated with landowning rural folks, historically. If you don't understand that they are more like that, it's weighted towards them, the kind of political makeup of these areas, I don't think you're getting a full picture of what the politics of rural America are.
Yeah, and I mean, I think your piece does a good job of highlighting that, and I think it's really important for people to understand that, just like any society, like it's frustrating sometimes when you talk to certain folks who they have a kind of idyllic picture of like what rural life is like, and you do a lot of things. It's like, one, both like being able to talk about this general history of like the class structure, but also noting that these also are incredibly diverse regions in the country. Again, like a lot of times people just sort of imagine a kind of small white farm owner, and that's not generally the case all across the country. But there is that shared experience, right? As you know, of like, of loss. And I think the really important political nugget to pull out of there is that, well, that's something that you can appeal to, right? It's like people have seen their community start to decline. There's certain people who have done very well during that decline versus others. But you can at least say, well, these things that used to exist in our communities have gone away. We've seen people have to leave the community, et cetera. And like you have a kind of shared common experience that you can draw upon politically, even if there is a kind of, growing gentry class. And I think most importantly is just like every other part of the country, is that, the non-voter, especially if you're interested in doing class politics in this country, like the non-voter becomes a really, really big puzzle. And just, to add some reading for people who are interested, there's a really great piece in Catalyst Journal called Behind the Republican Party Crackup by Paul Heidman, which sort of breaks down a lot of these relationships between, who the typical Republican voter is, what the actual class interest is there, versus, for example, wealthy voters in the Democratic Party. And like, again, like that's a group of people who very, very much benefit from, the accumulation that they've been able to enjoy over the past 30 to 40 years. They're not multi-millionaires. They're not living in larger cities. So they don't want to have that kind of same direct government influence, but they want the government to basically protect them and their interests. And you also cite Patrick Wyman's piece, American Gentry, which is phenomenal. People should really read that. And also Corey Robin's, really great distillation of like what conservative thought is. Or you won't understand conservative thought until you understand, that you have to have lost something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that book is so good. It was kind of crazy to come across it and be like, oh, someone said what I was like circling around, perfectly already. Yeah. No, I mean, I think one of the things about the Corey Robin quote is that I found so compelling was that, he kind of balances, he kind of toes the line that I saw correctly. It's like, okay, so people can have lost things and still be ahead in, if like, so someone could have lost half their family farm, and that can feel like, this enormous, blot on their life that has shaped them and made them kind of remember the past fondly in a way that makes them a conservative. And so it's like there's a real loss there, and there's still a landowner, which is like very few Americans can ever hope to be, whether it's a house or a farm. And so you can't deny that, like, some people who have these grievance politics in rural areas, like, on paper are enormously privileged and on top of the heap, and yet feel these grievances in a way where, like, there might actually be something that happened to them where the loss is, I mean, there's a real loss there. And I talk about an example of a real person who had lost part of their family ranch and has some of these characteristics, and it's like, okay, you still own part of the ranch and there was a loss there, and that's just complicated. But that's it's descriptive of a lot of people in rural America. But then, as you say, like, if you're just picturing small farms everywhere, like, that's just realistic. I think I cite a statistic from the census. There are more people employed in, manufacturing, care, and I forget what the other sectors are, but it's a couple. It's not or mine. All of the other sectors employ more people than farmers, than there are farmers in rural America today. So just focusing on landowning elites is, an important part of the economic puzzle of rural America. But you're ignoring literally millions of people if that's all you're thinking about.
Well, yeah, like the landowning is often, it's actually really owned by a bank, or they're being pressured, right? So like, that's why I don't like
or Bill
even
Gates.
talking about like, right, and or Bill Gates, yeah, exactly. And it's like the way like economic anxiety is sort of like thrown out as like something just to like, okay, we can stop at analysis there. It's like, well, no, like these folks might be privileged in the sense that they have land in their family, but also like we should still analyze like the capitalist forces that are ultimately going to dispossess them of that and sell it to Bill Gates.
Yeah. No, and and in some ways that's the story, is that, like, there's a lot of, like, quote unquote family farms that are tens of thousands of acres that have accumulated over the 20th century. Those are now being chunked up and lost to TIA, CREF, and Hancock, and some of these big financial institutions that have been buying up farmland like crazy over the past couple of years. And then Bill Gates, the single largest owner of farmland in the US right now. I believe he achieved that title in 2020. And Bill Gates is an investor, and I don't know why he's doing it, but like, I don't think it's that hard to figure it out that, climate change is going to dramatically reduce the amount of arable land globally and in the US over the next 50 years. And you might as well own as much as the food system as you can. It's going to be an investment in an increasingly scarce resource. And that, I think I remember when that statistic went out, it did kind of make the rounds online about Gates, but that feels like one that needs more attention. the accumulation. Yeah, there.
And the thing with Gates too, it's interesting. Whenever he's sort of asked about it, he sort of shyly just says like, "Well, my investment team has suggested that we do this." Right? It's very like calculated. It's like, "Oh, we're just looking at the numbers," which for some people that might seem like, "Oh, well, there's nothing necessarily sinister there. He's just making a business decision." But even if that's just it, that should worry you in the sense that like if one of the wealthiest people in this country is being told like you need to buy up as much land as possible right now, you should be worried about what they're thinking the next few years look like.
Well, and this was before even the Russia thing with like global wheat production suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, the more that like those global ag markets are unstable, the better that investment looks for Gates, I'm assuming. So yeah,
which is a little bit of a worried
it's
incentive when it comes to something as important as like wheat to the world
and food. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to sort of bring this. We're going to talk about Obama in a little bit and what he represented, because Obama is an interesting case where like you actually start to see some form of gains. And as you noted at the beginning of the segment, it hasn't always been this way that Democrats have struggled so dramatically in this part of the country. And also I also just have to add too that like it is interesting though that as you see dispossession of folks, the way that is being translated has been into this more kind of Republican conservative movement where like in Texas, for example, after the Civil War, you saw this massive repossession of small family farms, primarily by British and Northern capital. And the response for most of the farmers there was to create the populist movement to cut down barbed wire fences and like this real kind of populist, agrarian movement. So then there's the puzzle here, right? While we see all the statistics about how difficult life is getting there, we are seeing this move toward more, free market politics, culture war politics, et cetera. Could you sort of break down how you think, in the past few years in particular, the Democrats have responded to their losses? Because I think like the general kind of common sense thing that you hear on MSNBC is like the Claire McCaskill thing is like the Democrats have gone too crazy and too radical. We need to return to moderation. Funny from somebody who, has was a loser recently. And the second one is like this kind of search for like rural authenticity, right? If you just wear the right Stetson, you roll up your sleeves in the right way. I mean, Beto's now driving around in a pickup truck around Texas, right? That's going to be, the silver bullet. I mean, could you talk about how you would categorize the response over the past few years to this crisis?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, you can think of a number of figures on the more moderate side who have gained a lot of attention, basically saying, the Democratic Party needs to, appeal to moderates or you're going to lose rural areas. And, I think that, McCaskill, John Tester is still, and Tester's an interesting figure because he can be really progressive one minute and then not so much the next. I'm trying to think a few others. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I think a lot of that critique of the party, there does have this kind of like authenticity card comes in. Like, you got to know how to talk to rural people and you got to know, like, you got to look the right way, you got to speak the right way, you got to dress the right way. And, there is this kind of like proliferation of like, cowboy hat, candidates. And, like, it's not exactly new, right? And either, Reagan riding around on his horse and stuff like that. Like this has been, it's just politics and politicians playing dress up. And it's been a thing for a while, but it does seem like, there isn't a great coherent strategy for reversing these losses. And so, when it's like kind of like getting the cosmetics right, in the absence of like a more tangible organizing strategy, it can look a little weak sometimes. And the example I bring up in my story is so I live in Western Colorado, and Lauren Boebert, the far right member of Congress, she's my congressional representative, and the district isn't that red. I mean, it elected her, but it's about 52% of the vote. And there used to be kind of a a sort of a Democratic candidate that would do well in Western Colorado, often Hispanic, from kind of like long-term like ag families. Obama's Interior Secretary, Ken Salazar, his brother represented this district for a while. So, it's not out of reach, I guess is what I'm saying. But, so Boebert won. And, she's not much of a representative in terms of like getting stuff done for constituents, but definitely kind of just like inflaming Twitter wars whenever she can. And so, I think the Democrats saw this as a potential flip, and they put in all their cards behind this kind of rising star in the state party named Carrie Donovan. Very, pretty progressive candidate from a ski town, big fancy ski town called Vail. And I thought it was interesting when I was starting to research this story is that, she has all these, accomplishments, which were part of her campaign, but her first campaign video was like, I am a rancher. And it was like her in a barn jacket and a cowboy hat, riding a horse, tossing hay bales. And like her family does own a ranch, but it's this kind of like fancy, like fuzzy Scottish cow ranch, like outside of this fancy ski town. And like the point isn't to like pick apart her ranching credentials. Like I'm not a rancher. Like I sit in front of my computer and type things. Like like that's not the point of this. But it is like when you make a claim like that, you're opening yourself up to, like when you make an authenticity claim like that, you're opening yourself up to like being scrutinized. And it was like you could just kind of feel like the attack ads writing themselves. And then Colorado redistricted, and her home was actually never in this district. It was this ranch that she owned was like right on the border, and it just moved like barely, but it wrote it out. So then she didn't have a claim to the district anymore. And you can legally run if you don't live in the district, but it just made it that much harder. So she dropped out. And now the party hadn't, like, it was just her. Like they were, she was raising millions of dollars. Elizabeth Warren had endorsed her. The primary was kind of cleared for her, and then she's out. And Boebert, doesn't really look like is going to face much of a challenge now in this district that like conceivably should be competitive. And she's not like, doesn't seem like that strong of an incumbent, but here we are. And it's just one anecdote, but I think there are multiple examples over the past couple of years of Democrats kind of finding like what they thought was the right candidate running against some Republican who had some holes in their candidacy, and the Republican cruising. And I don't have any advice, right? Like I'm not a party strategist, other than like it's not working very well, whatever they're doing now.